Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Missouri and the New Tallgrass Prairie Economy. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. And by collaborating on the webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely non-profit and volunteer groups across the United States. The groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association Sustainability Committee, the Kansas City Native Plant Initiative, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Carol Davit. Carol has worked for more than 20 years in the conservation and environmental fields in many capacities. She has worked for private nonprofit conservation groups and for municipal and state government. Carol serves on the Missouri Monarch and Pollination Conservation Steering Committee, the Missouri Outdoor Action Committee, the Missouri Environmental Literacy Advisory Board. Carol is the chair of the Conservation Federation of Missouri's Grassland Committee and Grow Native Missouri's Invasive Plant Task Force. She's been the editor of field guides and written on a wide variety of natural history and conservation topics. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Penny. I appreciate the invitation to speak this afternoon, and my presentation has, first I'm going to give some introductory remarks and slides about the work that my organization does, which I think will provide some context to the part one and part two of my presentation. First part will be about the biological wealth and irreplaceability of Missouri's prairies, and I'll speak about prairie and native grasslands outside of Missouri a bit as well. And then the second part is on the new tallgrass prairie economy, which is really applying what we know and applying resources from our prairies to altered landscapes in the developed and developed landscapes. Throughout my talk, I'll be using the word landscapes and landscaping, and when I use the term, I usually mean it in a very general sense of land cover. But sometimes when I say landscapes, I'm referring to those designed by an architect or designer, but I will try to make that clear as I go along. The Missouri Prairie Foundation is a 53-year-old private nonprofit prairie conservation organization and land trust. We also run the Grow Native Plant Marketing and Education Program, and through that we run the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force to elevate the need for early detection and assertive control of invasive plant species in our state. At the heart of our work to protect prairie is land acquisition, and this slide shows prairies that my organization owns. Overlaying on that tan color you see is the pre-settlement prairie layer, 15 million acres at the time of statehood, fewer than actually 60,000 scattered acres remaining. A lot of the southeastern portion of the state where you see white was once much more open woodland, and there were a lot of prairie species in that area as well. So about 70% of our state had some assemblage of prairie species. And I'm going to show you just a few of these landscapes to give you a taste of what these original unplowed prairies look like. This is our Schwartz Prairie, Stark Family Prairie, Linden's Prairie, Snowball Hill Prairie, just 35 miles south of Kansas City, and Noah Brown's Prairie near Joplin. These are examples all of unplowed original prairies, nothing overseeded. These are all of the plant species you see here are there without human intervention, but maintained through human intervention. We manage these original prairies through a prescribed fire regime and in judicious spot spraying of herbicides to control invasive plant species, and much species monitoring to ensure that our management is sustaining and in some cases enhancing native biodiversity. We also engage in prairie restoration and reconstruction. So by restoration, I mean taking an original unplowed prairie that may be overgrown with brush and restoring it. And reconstruction, I mean actually taking seeds from a prairie remnant and seeding an area such as a former crop field, to reconstruct prairie. The photo you see in the lower right is an example of restoration, removing a tree line that was previously separating two tracts of prairie. We conduct lots of outreach, such as the talk I'm giving today, our production of the Missouri Prairie Journal, many hikes, presentations, campouts, and even some mentored hunting to help another sector of the outdoor recreation community learn more about prairie. We advocate for all native grassland types, prairies, but also glades like you see here, original savannas, and open woodlands, which are often found in association with glades. Through our Grow Native program, our goals are to increase the demand for and supply of native plants. So we do lots of consumer education and provide marketing tools to help reach our goal. And through the Invasive Plant Task Force, working with many different groups to really move forward early detection and assertive control of invasive plant species in our state. So with that introduction, I want to move into part one, biological wealth and irreplaceability of original prairies. This map you may have seen before depicts prairie in the central part of North America, and of course these prairie types would extend up into Canada. And the tallgrass, mixed grass, and shortgrass prairie that you see here are correlated with rainfall generally. Less rainfall as you go west, more rainfall as you go east, and the height of the vegetation corresponds. Prairie is an ecosystem dominated by warm season grasses and other non-woody perennial plants like wildflowers, legumes. There's up to 10% tree cover, so not much shade on a prairie. And by warm season, we mean plants that are reaching maturity at the warmest part of the year. Modern prairie, as we think about it today, developed in Central North America about 10,000 years ago, but it's really millions of years in the making. And there's a wonderful new article about this that I mentioned here in the right-hand corner, and I'll have that reference at the end. But this map doesn't tell the whole story because we have other grassland types in other parts of the country and continent. This is a map of grassland regions of Eastern North America. And of course, you see the Great Plains pictured here, and then Midwestern tallgrass prairie and savanna, 2/3 of which Missouri falls into. Then the Southeast interior grasslands and the coastal pine savannas. Now, you may have heard that the general definition that prairie is where there's not enough rain for trees to grow. Well, that only tells part of the story. In the Great Plains, that's generally true. There is not as much rain for trees to grow, but we certainly have ample rain in the Midwestern region and certainly in the Southeastern interior grasslands and the coastal pine savannas. So climate or rainfall is not the predominant driver, or not always the predominant driver. In the Southeast interior grasslands and coastal pine savannas, fire is the dominant factor in influencing grasslands. In the Midwestern tallgrass prairie and savanna region, it's fire, rainfall to a certain extent, and depending on the location, grazing. We often hear that prairies were shaped by bison, and in many cases that is absolutely true, but it's not true everywhere. There's still a lot we're learning about historic grazers and their influence on grasslands. And then in the Great Plains, climate or rainfall is definitely a big factor, and grazing and fire as well, but climate definitely the driver there, main driver. But this map doesn't even tell the whole story, because we, of course, have grassland types throughout the continent. We have them in Washington State and New Mexico, other places throughout the country, and even on Nantucket Island, as you can see here in the photo at the on the right. I like to think that those of us who were lucky enough to live in a prairie or native grassland region inherited this prairie wealth just by virtue of the fact that we ended up in these regions. And so I have a couple of slides showing how this prairie wealth is expressed. So in this grassland, of course, there's not much shade that you can see there, and that's contributes to the fact there are many blooming plants throughout the growing season. So there's plants blooming from March basically until November in Missouri, on Missouri prairies. Many blooming plants are a contributing factor to high insect diversity and abundance. And for example, in Missouri, there are more species of pollinating insects on prairies than any other habitat type in the state. And this abundance of insects and other invertebrates provides food for animals, birds and other animals on up the food chain. There's not just one kind of prairie in Missouri or in any other grassland region. In Missouri, there are 12 distinct prairie community types, and by this I mean, for example, loess hill prairies of extreme northwestern Missouri, sand prairies of extreme southeastern Missouri, or wet bottomland prairies, shale prairies, and so forth. Prairie is a gold mine of soil and soil microbial resources, and these play into the fact that prairie is wonderful at capturing carbon in the roots and soil, and I'll get into that later in the presentation. Prairie wealth is also expressed to us in sheer diversity of life forms and beauty, and I want to just show you just a snapshot of a few of these. 2 of the many orchid species we find on Missouri's prairies, pink katydids, Henslow sparrow, one of about 12 species of grassland birds. Unfortunately, they are in North America the most threatened suite of birds. Eastern tailed blue butterfly, elusive least shrew, greater prairie chickens, also an elusive animal, slender glass lizard, scissor-tailed flycatcher that, despite the burden of its extremely long tail feathers, migrates to Belize. And this prairie wealth is expressed below ground. 2/3 of living biomass of a prairie is beneath the soil surface in prairie systems. And of course, these deep roots evolved to survive a drying climate. It's a landscape dominated by herbaceous perennial plants. So these plants are continually growing. And these prairie root systems are continually growing, and they support the most diverse soil microbial communities on Earth. And this is largely due to the fact that the roots are continuously exuding substances into the soil. It's almost as if they were farming these soil microbial communities. In terms of mycorrhizal fungi, which are fungi that live in association with roots, they are highest in prairie systems. And again, this is due to these vast root systems. And research in 2012 has demonstrated that there's a correlation between the diversity of vegetation above ground and the diversity and abundance of microbial species or taxa in the soil. So there's an interdependency there. The plants need the fungi, and the fungi diversity is dependent on plant diversity. And we can have really extreme plant diversity on prairies. These 2 botanists are showing off a 20 by 20 inch square plot where they have identified 46 native plant species, and this has apparently broken a world record for plant species diversity at this scale. The previous record holder was 44 species for a grassland in the Czech Republic. This prairie that they are standing in is the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Pennsylvania Prairie in Dade County, Missouri. And the 2 photos on the left are 2 of the 46 found in that plot. And they are prairie-dependent species. This prairie, just to give you an example, is 160 acres, but almost 290 native plant species recorded, 40 of which can live nowhere else but on prairies. This prairie also has abundant wildlife, including northern crawfish, frogs, Henslow sparrows, northern bobwhite quail, regal fritillaries, which is the photo in the bottom right, and many, many others. So extreme diversity. Now let's take a look, an overview of prairie species diversity as a whole in Missouri. So if we were to take all the remaining prairie remnants in Missouri and identify all the plants on all of them, we'd have about 800, 12 grassland bird species, 5 amphibians, 13 reptiles, 7 crayfish, 8 mammals. Fish, we really don't know how many fish species live in prairie streams. These data are from Nelson's Terrestrial Natural Communities of Missouri. In terms of invertebrates, we do know that there are more than 200 species of native bees on Missouri's prairies, 190 prairie obligate moths. We don't know about a plant hoppers, which are very species rich. We know from one study at one prairie, there were 47 species documented. But in terms of other invertebrates like spiders, grasshoppers, katydids, butterflies, midges, beetles, dragonflies, we don't know. And so even though we can see most of these with the naked eye, we really don't know what we have. And then when we get into soil microorganisms, we're really just beginning to learn. The soil frontier is vast. I want to speak for a moment on conservation significance of our prairies. You no doubt know this warning of Aldo Leopold, or advice, I should say, to keep every cog and every wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And if we want to move forward into the future with us, rich biological diversity, recognizing and managing for species conservatism is really key to this. And by species conservatism, it means that different native species respond differently to changes and alterations of the landscape. So some species can tolerate significant impacts. They are generalist species. Take common ragweed, for example. It will be found on an original unplowed prairie, but you can find it along a cornfield where the soil's been disturbed. It can live in general habitats, whereas other species are restricted to site conditions more closely aligned with post-glacial, pre-Euro settlement landscape. They're more prairie dependent. So for example, there are many grassland species, but a subset of those are prairie dependent. The photo on the left is a buckeye butterfly. We will find it on Missouri's prairies, and I think its range is quite large in the United States, but it's not prairie dependent. It's on prairies, but it's also in my backyard in an urban area. Whereas the regal fritillary butterfly on the right is prairie dependent. I will never find it in my backyard. So if we want to save as many species as we can, we have to think about species conservatism and saving the habitats where these species occur. Another example, Canada goldenrod occurs on prairies, but it can occur in a ditch that's been disturbed. Grass pink orchid, on the other hand, is prairie dependent, found only on prairies. So if we want to save it, we have to save its habitat. Conservation significance in general of our prairies increases with these conservative species, also rare flora and fauna. Soils that are undisturbed, which are found under original unplowed prairies. Declining grassland species, they may not be dependent on unplowed prairie, but they need grasslands in general, and prairie is an important part of their habitat. The conservation significance also increases with a variety of other grassland species that may not be threatened, but they nonetheless need grassland habitat, and also the species in prairie streams. And the sum is greater than the parts. Beyond species diversity, the conservation significance of each prairie remnant is further compounded by the functions between and among species. For example, this rattlesnake borer moth larvae live only in the stems of rattlesnake master, and it's only been found on prairies. Want to close up this section with turning our attention to a recent study that reveals the importance of small habitat patches for biodiversity. And I hear this often, oh, there's just a small amount of prairie left. These are small isolated areas. What good are they? They were deemed to be of little conservation value, and attention has been focused on conserving large connected areas. But this paper shows how important small habitat patches for biodiversity are, and shows that if we were to give up on these small areas, we could lose many species, and biodiversity overall would decline as a result. This is, again, an image of the original prairie prior to statehood in 1821. And today we have fewer than 60,000 scattered acres, and though this loss is dramatic, we actually have more original unplowed prairie in Missouri than in some surrounding states. These are small isolated patches, but as you saw in the photos I showed of some of those prairie landscapes, they are indeed rich and vital habitat for so many species. Prairie, we lost prairie due to conversion to row crops, conversion of native habitat to non-native tall fescue grass, planted largely for cattle forage. Today we have about 14 million acres of this one plant alone. When when Europeans started settling the land, suppressed fire, and that caused generalist tree species to invade, resulting in lower biodiversity overall. Non-native invasive species threaten our prairies. Climate change is another threat, although there are many unknowns. Prairie may be less affected than other ecosystems, like higher altitude and higher latitude regions. Warmer temperatures may not be an issue for prairies. However, a wetter climate, which climate change may bring, may stimulate woody growth on prairies and lead to overall lower biodiversity. Vines seem to be better equipped to deal with higher CO2 levels, and they might become more prevalent on prairies. Rainfall and temperature extremes could promote more generalist species on prairies, although we don't know. Of course, prairies evolved with fire and, depending on the region, with less rainfall, but we don't know what further extremes will bring. So there are many unknowns. Now that so much prairie is gone, we don't give up. We save all we can, and we apply what we know. These original prairie remnants are reservoirs of biodiversity. Some of these species defy cultivation. They will occur nowhere else but on these prairies, but some can live in other places, and that brings us into the second part. But first, to summarize, the biological wealth and ecological complexity of original prairies are irreplaceable, and we can no more plant a prairie than we could plant cactus and call it a desert. I hear people often say, oh, I spread prairie seed on my place, come see my prairie. And I'll say, no, I won't see your prairie, but I'll come see your prairie planting. We can plant elements of a prairie, and we absolutely need to do more of this. And we are creating prairie plantings, but no one can create an ecosystem. And I say this to really underscore how important conserving original habitats are. And again, time is not on our side. Modern prairie developed 10,000 years ago. It's millions of years in the making. We cannot create an ecosystem in a few years, or in many human lifetimes for that matter. These original prairie remnants are the backbone for what I call the new tallgrass prairie economy. So we have original landscapes rich with native plants like this. And here I've identified just a few of the many plants from which seeds are harvested for the native plant industry. Another prairie remnant, and again, just a few of the many species, the seeds of which are collected. And seeds, of course, are just one aspect of plantings, of created landscapes, but they're a very important one. A colleague of mine, Mervyn Wallace, owner of Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, has underscored how important prairie remnants are as a guaranteed seed source, stating production fields for native seed collection can fail. Original prairie remnants and ones that are managed well are the only guaranteed seed source. So this is a very important point to remember. To give you an idea of the money changing hands, with seed, prairie drought seed grass going for $138 a pound, common milkweed $225 a pound, Jacob's ladder $500 a pound, Culver's root $675 a pound, and some prices are considerably higher than these. So we can take an ancient ecosystem, prairie, and use it as a model for new landscapes. And indeed, the photo you see on the right is a planting created from a landscape that looked much like the one on the left. We can use this kind of landscaping for many purposes, for landscaping in the sense of a landscape conceived by an architect or a designer, for stormwater management and flood prevention, for erosion control, pollinator habitat, wildlife and game habitat, livestock forage, bioenergy feedstock, carbon storage, even sources of new food crops. And the point that I want to underscore here is a simple one, yet it's kind of a new concept, which is that conventionally throughout human history, when we've created landscapes, we've created them for single purposes. We establish a lawn in front of a bank, and the sole purpose is for aesthetics. We plant a cornfield, and the sole purpose is for food. But with prairie plantings, we can have multi-purpose landscapes, or incorporating prairie plantings into other plantings, we can render them multi-purpose. And I'm going to take you through some examples. So if you look at the dark blue highlighted words on the screen, bioenergy feedstock, we might be creating a prairie planting with this chief goal. But while we're doing that, we're also managing stormwater and preventing floods. We're controlling erosion. We're creating pollinator, wildlife, and game habitat. We're storing carbon in the soil. Another example, say we want to create a prairie planting with the chief aim of pollinator habitat. But in doing so, we will also have the light blue highlighted benefits you see. Last example, we could be a cattle producer and we want to have forage palatable and lush in the hottest part of the year, so we create a prairie planting. But depending on how we graze it, we can derive these other benefits. So let's take a look at some of these landscapes. And in green type, you will see I've identified sort of the sector of the workforce that's benefiting or the economic impact. So here, turning to landscaping in the sense of an architect or a designer being involved. This is a residential landscaping. Residential landscapes on a bit more modest or informal scale. This is an industrial type of landscaping around a wastewater treatment plant. We have many such facilities in our country where we need a buffer around them for security reasons or for odor control or noise control. Well, instead of having lawn, we could be having a prairie planting that's providing many benefits. Prairie plantings in association with greenways or parks, reducing mowing, adding visual interest. All of these applications of using prairie plantings for landscaping, it doesn't just create more interesting work and diversify work for land care companies, but it's also increasing the amount of work year-round. So a conventional landscaping company might be mowing grass in the summer and plowing snow in the winter. But with a prairie landscape, a more complex landscape, there is maintenance in spring, summer, and fall. It's a kind of industry that's dependent on other kinds of diversified work. It's an industry dependent on someone collecting seeds for the native seed industry to support that landscaping in the summer and the fall. It's dependent on someone maintaining prairie remnants with prescribed fire in the wintertime. So it's helping to diversify the workforce. If we think about prairie landscapes for stormwater management and flood prevention, there's an enormous cost avoidance for communities. If you look at the text on the bottom, it's possible for as many as 7 inches of rain from one storm to be absorbed by intact prairie with no runoff. And it's extremely expensive to create hardscape that would perform these same functions. So here's an example of some prairie plantings to manage stormwater. 2 more high-end looking rain gardens that incorporate prairie plants. The one on the right is endowed by Anheuser-Busch. It's in St. Louis. Helps to illustrate that company's commitment to demonstrating investment in clean water upon which their product depends. Oh, I wanted to mention that native landscaping case studies at landscapeperformance.org is an excellent resource if you don't already know about it for many native landscaping case studies, before and after, costs, inputs, outputs, very good resource. Going on to another kind of prairie landscape, one designed for erosion control in terms of prairie strips. Here's another picture of a prairie strip incorporated within row crop agriculture. And prairie strips actually stands for strategic integration of row crops with prairie strips. This is a technique and research done in Iowa. We have a terrible problem in our country of creating a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico because so much nutrient runoff and sediment runoff creates high algal growth. And when that algae decays, it's robbing the water of oxygen, creating these areas that are impacting fisheries in the Gulf. But prairie strips could really help reverse this trend if they were used on a widespread basis throughout Central North America. This infographic summarizes study results of the STRIPS program. You can see that by planting just 10% of land in production agriculture, just 10% with prairie strips, 42% less runoff is realized, 95% less soil export, 89% less phosphorus export, 84% less nitrogen export. The costs per acre in 2006 for farmers were up to $35 per acre, but we could reduce this if we could enroll this program in the Conservation Reserve Program. Cost of fertilizer is $85 an acre, or was in 2006, but by retaining more of that nitrogen on the land, that cost could go down. Turning to another type of prairie landscape, for pollinator habitat. Enormous impact on our agriculture industry and our food security. There are enormous economic repercussions to loss of pollinators and many important reasons for sustaining their populations. Insect pollination in general contributes almost $30 billion of added value to our ag economy in the U.S. In Missouri, over 500,000 acres are planted in crops dependent upon or improved by the pollination services of honeybees and native bees. Honey production is important in our state. Bees and other pollinators sustain not just our insect pollinated crops, but also our native plant communities, and there are many benefits thereof. And again, in Missouri, our prairie remnants, about 400 species of pollinating insects, including about 200 native bees. These remnants are pollinator reservoirs. Very briefly, pollination is the successful transfer of pollen from the flower of one plant to the flower of another of the same species. Pollination occurs primarily by wind. About 15% of flowering plants in the world are wind pollinated, but the rest, about 85%, require animals, mostly insects, and most importantly bees, for pollination. In the Midwest, the chief pollinators are butterflies, bees, flies, moths, wasps, and beetles. And of these, bees are the most efficient because they're actively collecting and transporting pollen, and because they exhibit floral constancy, meaning when they go on a single pollen foraging trip, they're visiting the same species, thereby transferring pollen from one flower of one species to another flower of the same species. And pollinators are valuable not just to our economy, but to our health. Many of our vitamins and minerals are from insect-pollinated plants, not wind-pollinated ones. To underscore the importance of bee pollination, Whole Foods Market removed all produce from bee-pollinated crops before and after to help deliver this message. So, obviously, taking seeds from remnant prairies, creating prairie plantings, bolsters and sustains populations of pollinating insects, which we need for our food crops as well. Moving on to another kind of prairie landscape for wildlife and game habitat, and whether a landowner has original grassland habitat or planted, they can derive hunting lease income from that habitat. In Missouri, a study last year showed that per hunter, they derive $561 to over $1,000 per hunter in lease income. And on the flip side, if a landowner does not want to maintain that habitat him or herself, he or she can hire an ecological contractor to do the work, and there's more money in that person's pocket. Moving on to another type of prairie landscape, using prairie plants for livestock forage. Not only are there multiple benefits of carbon storage and wildlife habitat, but cattle have been shown to gain weight faster on natives versus fescue. You can see there 90 days on natives, 3.1 pounds a day, 90 days on fescue, 2.5 pounds a day. Work done by Steve Klubine in Missouri, who's done a lot of work on native grazing systems. Turning to yet another kind of prairie landscape, a prairie planting planted expressly for bioenergy feedstock. There's a project in northeastern Missouri whereby prairie planting like this, harvested in strips, and then through anaerobic digestion, methane is produced from that biomass. And all the while, the roots of those plants are storing carbon, and there are many other benefits. This carbon storage, very important topic, and I have a number of slides on this. I apologize, they're rather text heavy, but I know there's a lot of interest here. So So we hear a lot of talk about planting trees for carbon storage. We get a lot of attention about woody species in scientific literature and the popular press, but in many cases, trees are not the best choice to plant for atmospheric carbon mitigation, but prairie plants often are. And the next slides are largely information from two colleagues of mine, one at the University of Minnesota and also Steve Applebaum with Applied Ecological Services. So let's look at some facts here. 1 acre of prairie or prairie plantings can store 1 ton of carbon in roots and soil per year. Steve Applebaum has measured up to 5 tons of total carbon increases per acre under restored prairies through a grazing system. Let's look at some other facts. So root biomass in general is somewhere between 40 and 50% carbon, which was removed from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. When the roots die, some of that carbon is returned to the atmosphere when it's decomposed, but some is converted into other substances that become part of the soil and can persist for decades. Plant roots grow and die each year, and in the early years of a prairie's existence, like a planting, they usually grow more than they die. So prairie roots can be both a short and long-term mechanism for carbon storage. Prairies have species with many different root architectures. Some have shallow fibrous root networks, while others have long tap roots. And so because of this varied architecture, they're really efficiently filling up the soil space, and they're effectively growing. And sort of the bottom line is the better plants are growing in general, the better they're storing carbon. Carbon storage is correlated also with above and below ground plant and microbial productivity. We know that prairie soils have high microbial activity, so they're aiding in plant growth and how well they're thriving, and therefore how much carbon they can store. As a plant community, a prairie can remain productive under extreme water conditions because a prairie has species that are particularly resilient to such conditions and can be thus continue to grow when other species may be negatively impacted. We unfortunately see planting of trees in soil settings that don't have a historic tree cover, and that can de-water soils and also help decompose soil organic carbon. In parts of the planet with increased drought, such as in California, this will exacerbate stress complexes that include insects, fire, and invasive species, and can lead to higher tree mortality, slow regeneration in some species, and altered species assemblages. And because most tree roots are woody, they neither die back as regularly nor contribute to soil building as quickly. That means less carbon and organic matter are contributed to the soil. So Stephen Applebaum's #1 lesson is that we should plant trees only where the soils will benefit from it. So instead of thinking about what we have on the landscape, start more thinking about what do the soils need? What do the soils need most to store carbon in a particular area? And his second lesson is not to plant trees where inappropriate. So, for example, farmland where soils were formed under wetlands and grassland ecosystems, we should be restoring those areas as much as we can with deep-rooted grassland plants. His third lesson is that in the face of drought and increased wildfires, rebuilding soils is a safer strategy for storing carbon, and that scientific analyses have shown that recapturing atmospheric carbon into soil and plant communities is the easiest and least expensive method for mitigating climate change, and it provides many other benefits. Restoring soils in currently farmed land can rein in up to 15% of annual carbon emissions that we Americans create, and replanting native grasslands and restoring drained wetlands can reduce this up to another 20%. This is my third to the last slide, and if any of you have questions and you haven't already posted them, please do so now. So the last type of prairie landscape I want to mention are prairie planting as a source of a new food crop. And the Land Institute in Kansas has really done a lot of research on this. This is a photo of a field of rosin weed, and researchers there are looking at producing edible oil from the seeds, like how we get oil from sunflower seeds. But the difference here is these are perennial plants, so they're roots, so they don't have to be planted every year, and there are multiple benefits from this kind of perennial agriculture. So to summarize, the many different kinds of prairie landscapes that can be created for these different goals. If this is very interesting to you, I encourage you to learn more about our program grow native, and there may be somewhat similar programs in other parts of the country, but this network of professionals and the work that we do is really helping to drive what I call different aspects of the new tallgrass prairie economy. You can learn more at grownative.org. And this is my contact information, and I have 4 references here that I mentioned during the course of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carol. This is such incredible information about the prairies that I was certainly not aware of. We have a few questions for you. You mentioned the judicious use of herbicides in some of the prairie maintenance. Can you elaborate?
Yes. So we use glyphosate for many species, things like tall fescue that can invade some of our prairies. We use, oh dear, I don't have the chemical name, but the trade name is Remedy for a lot of legumes. And the way we use herbicide is generally with a backpack sprayer or on foot. So it's a very targeted approach. For invasive woody species, that can involve mechanical removal and then spraying the sprouts. It's a way to kind of use less herbicide. Is there a particular, if you have a follow-up question, if I haven't answered that fully or satisfactorily.
All right. This is about the photo that you showed a few times of the Linden Prairie. And the question is, was the skyline color natural or enhanced?
Yeah, it was natural. That is incredible photo, and it is natural. The photographer didn't use any filters. And that prairie it looks like that in June. If you walk in that prairie, you will cry. It is so beautiful.
It was a lovely photo.
And actually, the photo that I'm showing now is the same prairie.
Mm-hmm.
Different location.
Yes, nice. When grazing stops, is there sufficient diversity in the seed bank that's still viable that a prairie can reestablish?
Well, remember that these are mostly perennial plants and they are relatively long-lived. So even and prairie plants have evolved to withstand grazing. So the growing points of prairie plants are at or below the soil surface. So even though a plant is being grazed, it's still alive. Now there is a certain point. I mean, if you are grazing it so much and there's so much compaction and it's been grazed to literally the level of the soil over and over and over, that can weaken the plants, and so yes, you're right. If there's not a sufficient native plant seed bank, you can see encroachment of more aggressive non-native species. And it depends how you're rotating the cattle. If you are not continuously growing, but you're grazing, but you're rotating them, you could allow for some plants to flower and seed, and then for that seed to drop. So there's not a clear-cut answer. It all depends on the stocking rate of the cattle, and it depends on the type of grazing. Are they going through a whole bunch of cattle at one time, and then they're not coming back to that same paddock for months or maybe even years, or are they being continuously grazed? There's so many variables.
Okay. You mentioned seed collection a few times. Is seed collection in natural prairie remnants sustainable?
That's a good question. This is something that we think about a lot. It is quite hard to over-harvest seed, and I'll explain why. When you collect seed, Well, first of all, in a native prairie, like this photo you see in front of you, okay, there's some coneflowers there in the foreground, and then they'll be scattered throughout there. Are you going to, and if you're hand collecting, are you going to go to every single flower? Probably you are going to miss some. Even if you don't, or say, let me think of another species. Well, the coneflower, for example, or really a lot of species, you're going to collect it right before it's going to shatter and fall. You can't collect it too soon because it's not mature or, quote, ripe enough. So you have to wait until it's just about to shatter. Well, timing that is really hard. A lot is going to shatter and fall to the ground before you collect it. There is a lot of I've seen recent discussions about this and articles, and it is definitely something to think very carefully about. However, we feel pretty confident that we're not over harvesting. We have contractors for seed harvesters to collect seed, and we specify a percent of the area from which they can collect as well. So we have a lot of safeguards in there. And you do always want to have a native seed bed, but as I've stated before, we really don't know how many of these plants are recruited through seed and how much are spreading through the growth of one single plant.
All right. You mentioned planned fires several times. Are the planned fires primarily to suppress woody plants, or what are the other purposes?
To control woody plants is certainly one, and it helps control non-native herbaceous species like tall fescue, for example. The other is to remove thatch, so thatch would be sort of a buildup of dead plant material. And that's for a few reasons. One, when you remove that, the sun reaches the soil surface faster. It stimulates germination of seeds that might be there and stimulates regrowth of the perennial plants that are there. And also because different species of grassland wildlife need different kinds of vegetative structure. So grasshopper sparrows, for example, they need quite thin vegetation. They sort of run along the prairie, the surface, sort of like a mouse, okay? They sort of running along, and many prairie plants are bunch plants, and so they're sort of in bunches. They're not this complete sod, and so there's spaces for them to run around. Little mammals and turtles and things like that, they can run around between the plants. But if there's a lot of thatch buildup, it's harder for them to move. It's harder for them to find insect food, things like that. Whereas, so that's another reason for burning, to remove that thatch. And what we normally do is we take a prairie and we burn 1/3 of it a year. So 2/3, sometimes a half, it depends. 1/2 to 2/3 is unburned in a year, and then the next year we'll burn the portion, the next portion, and the next year the next portion, so that over 3 years the entire area portions of it have been burned once. And so we want to leave that vegetative structure because there are other birds like Henslow sparrows that need a lot of thatch, and there are overwintering insects that live in the stems of standing dead plant material, and they're wildlife that need cover. So we always have a portion unburned as well.
And what is the timing of these burns?
Yes, good question. For our organization, we do only dormant season burns, but they can begin as early as October. And for example, as of March 11th, we are completely done burning. There are advantages to burning at different times of the year. And it's also important to think about pre-European settlement when these prairies burned. So prairies burned naturally when there was lightning, and the most lightning occurs when you have thunderstorms, and the most thunderstorms occur probably in March and July, maybe. I'm not sure, but so sometimes there were burns in the growing season naturally. So that's something to think about. And then Native Americans burned at different times of the year to maybe drive game or for a variety of reasons. So you have to think about that human influence of, you know, history of burning by Native Americans. Does that, I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
So, okay.
Can you describe some of the research available on landscapeperformance.org?
Well, I don't have it in front of me, but you can see case studies of not just native landscaping, but many aspects of green, quote, green architecture. But there are, for example, examples of stormwater management plantings and other scaping to manage stormwater. And there are examples of native landscaping for maybe stormwater management, but also pollinator and aesthetic enhancement. And there'll be examples of that. Each case study will show like before and after, input costs, and then maybe cost savings. Let's see. I think there are other examples such as energy efficient buildings. There are other case studies about hardscape as well, not just about landscape architecture.
All right, thank you. Can you elaborate on the plant list used in the prairie strips?
Okay, so thinking of prairie strips in terms of the Iowa the Iowa formal prairie strips project, I don't have that plant list in front of me. If I can rifle through and find an article while we're talking, I might be able to find it. But I believe it contained, you know, grasses and wildflowers. I am not sure if I'm going to lay my hands on that, but if whoever asked that question wants to email it to me, I will be very happy to look that up for you and give you a better answer.
All right. Is the livestock forage multi-species, and what sort of natives are used?
I am not a native forage expert, but I will attempt to answer this question. In the work that Steve Klubine did, and he's the one who gave me those figures on the weight gain, he definitely uses many species. He uses several species of grasses and numerous forbs or wildflowers as well. So there's definitely a diversity. I think some of the chief things would be things like big blue stem, little blue stem, Cytodes, gamma grass, Cytodes gamma grass, probably things like maybe gray-headed coneflower, ironweed. I'm not sure of all of the forbs, but again, I would be more than happy to ask him what his forage pasture is composed of. So whoever asked that, if you want to email me, I will be happy to get that complete list to you.
Very good. Another question, is there an equivalent organization like yours for the prairies in Kansas?
There is the Grassland Heritage, I think it's called the Grassland Heritage Association. And there's also the Kansas, or maybe it's called the Prairie Land Trust or the Kansas Land Trust. So there's a private, state-based private nonprofit that I believe is, I don't know if they own land, but they do hold easements on prairie. Then there are national groups like the Nature Conservancy that operate in Kansas, and there are state agencies in Kansas working on prairie. There's tons of prairie in Kansas doing a lot of research as well.
Very good. And we have one last question here. How is atmospheric carbon storage affected by your cyclical burning?
There is carbon release when we burn, no doubt about that. However, we know that we will have less plant growth without burning, and I think this has been demonstrated pretty widely in the literature. But again, I would be, if whoever asks me that wants to email me, I will put my hands on what I can find and send it. So yes, so we do have a release of carbon when we burn, but over the long term, we would have less carbon, but that burning it's a stimulant to plant growth. And so it's the plant growth and the continued and enhanced plant growth that is enabling more carbon to be stored in the soil. So there's a net gain.
Right. Right. That certainly makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Carol. That was the last question that we have. I really appreciate you sharing all of this information. The prairies obviously have always been a sense of wonder and beauty to everyone, and this certainly gives us a lot more information about the greater value that they offer and the new economy, as you described. So
well, thank you. Thank you, and I invite you all to check out our website. We've got lots of events and workshops, and you can camp out with us on National Prairie Day, which is the first Saturday in June. So thank you all. Have a good day.